All right, good evening and welcome to part two of the Denver Mayoral Candidate Forum brought to you by the Hampden Heights Civic Association. My name is Mark Orrs and I am president of the HHCA and will serve as moderator of tonight's forum. In this runoff election, there are two candidates running to represent Denver as mayor, Kelly Brough and Mike Johnston. Each candidate will be allocated a total of 30 minutes of time with us, starting with Kelly Brough last Thursday in part one and followed in part two tonight with Mike Johnston. I will now post each candidate's official campaign website into the chat so that you can look more closely at their campaign and platforms. I will start by asking the candidates to introduce themselves before moving on to questions submitted and rank voted by members of the HHCA. Please note that a recording of tonight's forum will be made available to the public. Mike, you may begin now. Please open with up to 5 minutes of introduction.
Thank you all so much for having me, and delighted to be together and looking forward to the conversation. And a little bit about me and background of both why I got into the race and why I think this moment is so important in Denver's history. For those of you I haven't met before, I started my career as a teacher and a high school principal. I'm a fourth generation teacher, and started my first job was in Greenville, Mississippi, teaching English in what was then one of the poorest counties in America. I came home to Colorado as a school principal, and I was the principal of 3 different high schools around the city. I ran a high school that served all kids in juvenile detention centers. I ran a high school that served kids who lived in residential treatment centers around the state. And then I also took over a high school where in Thornton, where we had mostly families of immigrants who were sorry, hold on. We have a minor beeping problem here. Hold the break. The old emergency brake left on is always the challenge when driving. That was how I started my career. But when I was as a principal up in Thornton, we had a school mostly of Mexican Guatemalan immigrant families. We were able to turn that school around from one with a 50% dropout rate into what became the first public high school in Colorado where 100% of our seniors all graduated and they were all admitted to 4-year colleges. And that seemed like a great success until we discovered that about a half of those students were undocumented. And that meant in Colorado at that time, they couldn't go to college without paying out-of-state tuition. And so that was what first got me into politics, was realizing unless we changed the law, those kids would be stuck. And so I ran for the state Senate, was elected from Northeast Denver, and was able to work with the broad coalition to finally succeed in changing that law. I spent 7 years in the state Senate and moved my office to North Park Hill. I had a community office there for almost 10 years. I got the chance to work on a number of big progressive issues, including key battle over gun safety, where we were able to successfully bring major change in the form of universal background checks and high capacity magazine bans. Also got to work on everything from criminal justice, economic development, to civil unions, and was proud of that service. I left the legislature and have spent the last 3 years as the CEO of a foundation here in Denver. We've been taking on some of the city's toughest problems. I worked with the broad coalition to help pass universal preschool in 2020 for the first time after many failed attempts. We helped respond to COVID by keeping schools open, by providing COVID testing and vaccinating around the state. We helped test and vaccinate more than 1 million Coloradans with the partnership of local laboratories in the state and the city. And then we also, for the first time, brought a coalition to go to the ballot in 2022 to take on affordable housing, both affordable housing and homelessness through Proposition 123 last year. So I think I've had the opportunity to both lead in nonprofit sectors, in the government sector, the private sector, but most importantly, I'm focused on what the biggest issues facing Denver are. And for me, those are around, one, how do we take on the real challenges we face around homelessness? I think when we look at the challenges the city faces right now, we know tonight we have more than 1,400 people who are out on the streets of Denver trying to find a place to sleep, either under a bridge or on a sidewalk tonight. We know about 80% of our teachers and nurses and firefighters can't afford to live in this city tonight that they serve. So we have a huge focus on how I would help build 25,000 units of permanently affordable housing to help make the city affordable. And then how we get back a city that's safe, meaning one where we know we can feel like in any neighborhood, you can go out and take a walk with your kids or sit on a patio and have dinner and not worry once about their safety. And I think that is possible for Denver, and that's what I will build, which is a city that will feel vibrant and affordable and safe in all of our neighborhoods. And so that's a little bit about how I got into this race, what I'm inspired to build, and why I think right now the city's looking for a real progressive leader who's brought big ideas to deliver historic results on some of the city's hardest problems. And I feel like my experience doing that puts me in a great spot to help lead the city. So I will stop there and excited to answer any questions, thoughts, comments folks may have. And thank you so much for having me.
Great, thank you. We will now devote time to questions submitted and rank ordered by our members. We will get to as many questions as possible, and the more succinct the responses, the more questions we'll get to. The first topic that came up has several questions related to it, and it's around crime and policing, including funding of the police. And I'll start with a question from one of our members. Last week, just one block away from the Hampden Heights Swim and Tennis Club, 5 people were shot. This was not the first incident in the apartments surrounding our neighborhood where gunshots are heard with some regularity and other shootings have occurred. What are your priorities for reducing violent crime, and what are some specific recommendations for what our RNO can do to help address violent crime around our neighborhood?
Great. Thank you so much for that question. And yes, sadly, I've heard these stories all over the city where talked to a family last week who had a shooting through their front window as they were trying to feed their kids dinner, and then called the police and no one responded for about 12 hours. And so for me, there's a couple things I think we have to do here. One is I do think we are really short staffed on officers, and I would put 200 more officers and first responders onto the streets of Denver. I say both because we want to make sure that we can have the right first responder to respond to the right incident. And so that means if someone is having a mental health crisis, we don't want to send an officer. We want to send a mental health first responder. But if someone is in an overdose, we want to send a paramedic or an EMT, not an officer. But when we have violent crime, when we have property crimes, what we need to have are officers who can respond. And right now they're overtaxed and understaffed, and so they can't do that. So those officers help make that possible. It also, for me, means a different kind of deployment of officers. We actually want back, when I travel around the city, people will say, why do I never see officers in my neighborhood? And it's partly because we're understaffed, partly because we've moved away from a practice of real community-based policing, where officers are actually out walking beats in the neighborhood, talking to business owners, talking to residents, being highly visible, and helping prevent crime before it happens, and helping intervene whenever something does happen. So for me, those are all critical, important steps. It also means focusing more on prevention and intervention. It means helping for young people, getting them access to high quality after school and summer programming to prevent. The best way to keep the gun out of the hand of a 17-year-old is to make sure that kid, when he's a 12-year-old, finds a passion or a purpose that he's excited about. So it's about prevention early. It's about intervention. As soon as we find people who have made significant mistakes, we provide real intense wraparound services to keep them out of the prison system. And then it is about really enforcing the law. I also think it's about setting a certain expectation for what's allowable in Denver, to say there are certain things we won't tolerate anymore. That means using drugs in public. That means harassing a mom and her kid on the way to a Nuggets game. That means stealing bikes and cars in people's backyards. We got to actually enforce those things to make sure people know this is a city where their safety is the top priority. And I think we have not done that.
Thank you. Our next question is a yes or no question. Do you support defunding the police, where that is defined as reallocating or redirecting funding away from the police department to other government agencies funded by the municipality?
I do not. I believe there are other interventions we can use in addition to police, like the mental health workers I described, or like the EMTs and paramedics, but I do not support reducing the budget for public safety. I think we need that budget entirely to get the officers and first responders back onto the street that we need.
All right. And our last 2 questions are related to nonviolent crime and riding RTD. One member asks, how can we make a serious and quick dent in the nonviolent crime situation, car thefts, porch pirates, thefts of items from grocery stores in plain sight, etc.? And the other question states, recently my family and I have been unable to utilize the H line into downtown on the RTD light rail. Some of the reasons we are not able to rely on this transportation is because there are not enough drivers for the light rail, and so lines are canceled. But the other reason is it is dangerous, and on more than one occasion I have seen drug use or homeless sleeping on a train bodily fluids on the train, and individuals sleeping or passed out on the platform at Yale Station. What will you do if elected mayor to solve this dangerous situation for public commuters?
So thank you so much. A couple things I want to talk about, both the broader public safety here and also safety, particularly on light rail and transit. What we know right now is when we don't provide public safety on our public transit, it means it drives down ridership dramatically. People don't feel safe, don't want to use it. And that means we have more cars on the street, more impact on climate, but fundamentally, people not feeling safe. And so for me, step one is I do think we need more security in and around light rail stops and bus stops. That should be a partnership between RTD and the city, in the same way that safety around schools needs to be a partnership between DPS and the city. But I will not allow the city to get unsafe because of budget crises. If RTD or DPS are not willing to provide safety around those sites, I will make sure we do it, because the most important thing you do in a city is establish a sense of safety. That's also why when I talked about community-based policing, that is around having officers that are out in the community, being present and being visible in places where they know there's the highest risks of potential incidents. We want to have them there early and often to make sure they can support public safety in those places. And then it also means, I think, focusing on the significant number of people we have in the city who are committing crimes because of serious addictions and serious mental health issues. We know people need support for those. We also know we can't just sit back and let the city be taken over by folks that are committing crimes, even if they do have those needs. So what I would do is take 2 pods of the county jail and I would convert them, one to be an inpatient mental health based facility and one to be an inpatient addiction based program. The reason why I would do that is right now we have repeat criminal offenders whose criminal behavior is driven by addiction or mental illness, and they're not getting treatment, they're not getting well, and they're not getting pulled off the streets. And so what these pods would allow us to do is if someone has committed multiple crimes because of addiction or mental health, they can be ticketed, they would be prosecuted, and they can come to either a mental health court or a drug court. And that would allow you to either get outpatient treatment where you can get healthy and get well. If you're not willing to do that or don't succeed in that, we would sentence you to one of these inpatient facilities where you would have 30 or 60, 90 days to get the treatment you need, get back on your feet, and get back to a life of dignity. Right now, we know what's happening when I talk to officers is we have people that are getting booked 5, 6, 7 times in a day, being arrested 5, 6, 7 times a day, and being put right back out on the street. That's not working for the city, and it's not working for those people. So I would stop that practice and say, we have to actually make sure that we're keeping the city safe. And if people are committing repeated crimes, they have to either get access to treatment or go to inpatient treatment. So they can't continue to make the city unsafe. So for me, it's a combination of those couple of things that would drive very different outcomes for public safety.
Great, thank you. Our next topic relates to business revitalization, specifically in our own neighborhood. We have 2 questions. The first is specific to our neighborhood and the other is more general. With so many businesses closing down on Hampden between Tamarack and Havana, how would you plan to revitalize the area and attract new businesses? And more generally, Southeast Denver has a lot of wonderful qualities. It is still missing some key components that could really propel its viability as a sought after business district. If elected, what is your plan to help make sure our neighborhoods and business districts reach their full potential so that residents have opportunities to reinvest their hard-earned paychecks back into their own neighborhoods?
Yeah. My first step on this is always listening. So my first step would be to come down and sit with you all and to talk to business leaders about what are the key drivers? What are moving them out right now? Is it that there's not enough volume of business? Is it that there are challenges around costs or regulations? Is it that we don't have the right amount of traffic coming through those businesses? And figure out how we can help be a part of the solution. Oftentimes I find that the city is actually thwarting the efforts of small business owners and making their life harder, whether it's because they can't get permits done, they can't get regulations approved, they can't get expansions they want to their business, or the city has cumbersome regulatory environments that are driving up costs. I want to look at what the things are the city can stop doing to make it easier for business to succeed, and what we can start doing to make it easier. For me, that means, doing more small business support where we can invest dollars in small businesses earlier and more quickly. So we're not making small businesses wait 18 to 24 months for a small grant to expand operations or hire new staff. I think we need to have a city that really is driven and focused on customer service. And that means making sure we are directly providing services that small businesses need. So I think that would be important for us. I think the other is, what are the other things we can do to attract and make it easier for people to use local businesses? Sometimes that's around housing. How do we make walkable, bikeable neighborhoods that attract people to those small businesses? So if you can bring density to places where you have retail and commercial opportunities, so that there are more potential customers to use those. Also allows us to use public transit better. To your earlier point, we want to do density in places where you have public transit, so people don't have to use cars and can get to and from their school or work or hobbies. And so I think this is about a coordinated effort between what we do with business development, what we do with transit, what we do with housing, and what we do with grant dollars to make sure we're building these walkable, livable commercial centers that people will come to and stay in.
Thank you. Our next topic is on homelessness, including homelessness encampments. I would like to first ask you 3 yes or no questions, and then ask you more open-ended questions where you can expand. The first yes or no question: do you agree with Denver's urban camping ban? And if not, would you seek to overturn it?
I have said I will enforce it, and I would not overturn it.
Do you agree with forcibly clearing encampments that are in violation of Denver's urban camping ban?
So I believe the first strategy is to actually get people access to housing. And so I think the reason why it hasn't worked is because we're moving people from one block to the next with no place to go. So I would stand up housing for people around the city and then move them from those campsites to the transitional housing set up for them.
And finally, do you agree with forcibly arresting or committing people who do not agree to go into shelter or housing options provided by the city, or who refuse to go to treatment for mental health or drug issues?
So I do not believe in arresting people for the act of being homeless on their own. I do believe if someone's committed a crime, then they can be arrested and charged for that. And so if someone is using drugs illegally, or if someone is distributing drugs, or if someone is harassing or assaulting other people and they're committing crimes, then yes, they should be ticketed and they should be placed into the kind of treatment programs I described. But I think the focus needs to be standing up housing units that people have access to, moving them to those units. And those people that refuse to move, they cannot stay where they are currently. So they have to move those camps and those belongings towards one of these safe outdoor spaces or micro communities. And if they are committing crimes, then yes, they should be arrested. But I do not believe in arresting people for the sheer act of being homeless.
And our final question, which is more open-ended on this topic. Over the course of this election cycle, homelessness has been a hot topic and one of legitimate concern given the scope of the problem. While a lot of the attention on the issue has been centered around Civic Center Park and Capitol Hill, we are seeing the impacts of homelessness in Southeast Denver as well. Evidence of homeless encampments are found regularly now in Hensel Park, including trash, needles, and other drug-related paraphernalia along the trails and creek banks. How do you plan to enforce existing laws related to public camping while also working to tackle the root cause of this epidemic so we can solve it once and for all?
Yeah, I really appreciate the way you phrased that question, because I think that is exactly how to approach it, which is we start by what we know the root causes are. The root causes are people that need access to housing, because housing's got very expensive, access to mental health, and access to addiction treatment, and access to workforce training. And so what I would do is build these micro communities, which are, you take half-acre or acre lots around the city, and you can put 40 or 50 tiny homes on those sites. You can move people who are in encampments out of encampments and into that housing. But more importantly, on those micro communities, you have mental health support, you have addiction treatment, you have wraparound workforce training, so that all the services people need are right there in that community. It also means people don't need to be concentrated in downtown or in other areas where there's a lot of the service providers, because right now they're all concentrated in places where the services exist. By decentralizing services, you can also then serve people more effectively and not have to get heavy concentrations of the homeless that we have right now. And so that's, for me, focusing on the root causes. But the part that is focused on the immediate outcomes is also saying, once we've created that housing and people have places to move, which we can do quickly, they don't have the right to they'll still then sleep on someone's front yard or sleep on someone's sidewalk or be in front of someone's business. We will provide housing and allow people to move to it. And those folks that don't move there, we can require to move so that they're not still taking up public spaces that should be open for all of us.
Great, thank you. I believe you already addressed our next question, which is what are the top 3 or 4 issues you feel are facing Denver, but feel free to expand more. The next question after that is related to affordable housing and reduced costs of living. Housing affordability has become a major issue in Denver in recent years. Over the long term, I'm worried my kids will not have the opportunity to continue to live in Southeast Denver and raise a family in the same neighborhood that they grew up in. As a candidate, what is your plan to reduce the cost of living in Denver and make sure it remains a viable and inclusive community where middle-class families can still make a life for themselves?
Yeah, for me, I agree. The most important three issues are the ones you named. It is homelessness, it is affordable housing, and it is public safety. But on this housing one, this is so critical because what we have to do is be able to create units where people can afford to live long term. And so what I would do here is build 25,000 permanently affordable units. And what that means is people can rent these units. I'll talk about home ownership in a minute. People can rent these units, and the structure is if you make less than 100 or 120% of the area median income, so that's maybe $100,000, you can get access to one of these units, and the guarantee is you never have to pay more than 30% of your income to rent. So that means if you are a first-year teacher who makes $40,000 a year, you don't have to pay more than $1,000 a month in rent, and the rent doesn't go up unless your income goes up. That would allow teachers, nurses, firefighters, public servants to stay in the city and not worry every month that they're going to get pushed out and their rent's going to get increased. I think the other part is making sure we can get people access to home ownership, which is one of the two big challenges are right now. People might have a job and they have good income and they have good credit, but they can't actually get into a home because they don't have the down payment. And so one thing I would do is we built a fund called the Deerfield Fund, which helps provide down payment assistance to families who want to be able to own a home. It's up to $50,000 they can access for a down payment. They keep it, and when they refinance or sell the home, pay it forward to the next family. I would expand that around the city. The second one is being able to create land trusts where you work with a Habitat for Humanity or a nonprofit, and they might own the land, but what happens is the home is built on top of it, and someone can buy it at a much discounted rate. So maybe now instead of paying $600,000 for a home, you're paying $300,000. But that $300,000 means the home is owned by the nonprofit, and whenever you sell it, you can only sell at a limited capacity. So maybe you sell it for $350,000. That keeps the initial purchase of the home low, allows you to get into that unit, and the next person that buys it allows it to stay affordable over time. Those give us real opportunities to increase home ownership. And the last thing I would do is build more for sale condos that allow us to have people buy what is the new version of a starter home, which might be not a starter home, but a condo that you can get into before you can get into a full single family home. So those are, and that's why I spent the last 2 years working on Proposition 123, which was the first statewide effort to pass permanent funding and regulatory change to make it easier to build affordable housing, which is what I would do as mayor.
Thank you. Could you talk about your position on the statewide effort to restrict single family zoning?
Yeah, I think that we put together a different approach than the state did when we built Prop 123. And I think that's the approach that works better, which is rather than mandating every city to adopt a certain zoning policy, what we did is made every city or county set goals for their affordable, to say every city or county must increase their stock of affordable housing by 3% a year. So in Denver, that's about 1,500 units a year we need to build. But it allows the local government's flexibility on where and how to build that. They get to decide where the density goes, how big that density is, how it's spread out across the city. And so I think that's a better way to approach it, which is to be able to give flexibility on how people build without having to mandate zoning, but to require that they actually build those affordable units and show proof of it if they want to get access to funding.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We have one final question, which I invite you to address as a closing statement as well, perhaps. And then we can take additional questions if you would like. How do you differentiate yourself from your opponent?
Great question. I think we both have differences in our track records over the last 20 years. And I think we have differences in our approach to how we solve these problems. So I think in terms of our track record, I've spent my career committed to serving communities around the city, whether that was as a state senator, as a principal, as a foundation leader. But I've also had the opportunity to really take and build real diverse coalitions to get them done. That means things like being able to get immigration reform done to allow undocumented kids access to college. It means things like bringing universal preschool statewide, but had not been done before. We had to bring together conservatives, Democrats, independents. It meant things like affordable housing and homelessness we got done with a coalition of 260 organizations. That's a big vision on very hard problems where we build broad coalitions and deliver historic results. That's what we've had the chance to do. I think that's very different from some of the approaches that my opponent has taken, where on some of these key progressive issues, she's been on the other side, right? I supported increasing minimum wage for Denver voters. She opposed it 4 different times. I supported helping families get access to medical and family when needed it. She opposed it. I also supported things like greenhouse gas emissions reductions to help reduce our climate impact, things that she's been on the other side of. And so I think we have difference in this space. We also have different strategies of how we go about leading. And I think our record of taking on hard problems and delivering results. And I think for me, that's the biggest distinction of both what we've done and what we would do going forward.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Mike. We are just about out of time, and it doesn't seem that there are any questions in the chat or anyone raising their hand. We really appreciate you taking your time with us today and doing double duty with family duty. So thanks very much. We appreciate your time with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for your patience with our student driver. I thought it went pretty well, so I give him a passing grade.
Great job. All right, thank you, everybody.
Thanks,
we'll
y'all.
be sharing a recording. Please share it with your friends. We appreciate it. Good night.
Have a great